Chapter 15. We get to talk about administrative agencies and the Commerce Clause and other such things. I got a fairly long PowerPoint, but I think we can get through it pretty quickly. I got a lot of slides like the one you see here. We'll look at it maybe a little more closely here with some comics on there and whatnot. This is I'd call it a growing part of our law. Very much a growing part of our law, right? It was set up constitutionally, so it was set up originally by our forefathers, right? that at least in the commerce sense, have the authority to regulate business activities. I think the official word is that Congress shall have the authority to regulate commerce amongst the states and with foreign nations and with here we go. Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So there's the text of the Commerce Clause from the Constitution itself. And so it's interpreted very, very broadly in some areas, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the regulation of foreign commerce kind of goes without saying that we've always expected that the federal government would regulate foreign commerce, and some of this comes into play. They've talked about it. States have sued the federal government even over the immigration thing, and how maybe the federal government isn't living up to its responsibility in terms of controlling immigration and the impact that has on the states and whatnot that are certainly along the border. Interstate commerce is probably a far more, gray area, I guess you would call it. It's been interpreted very, very broadly, and I think some states have pushed back a little bit, and we'll talk about that as we get into it. Certainly, the Commerce Clause also has limitations as to what the states themselves can do, and limitations as to state taxation. We'll talk about. Kind of already hit that, right? Federal government has exclusive right to regulate foreign commerce. It does say the states can regulate commerce if it occurs entirely within state boundaries, and that's the part that that's almost a misnomer, right? Commerce among the several states, and it says persons engaged in activities affecting. Okay, and the power is very broad, and I refer you to a case, it's been quite a while back, 70s. Maybe Wickard versus Filburn, and Filburn I think was the Secretary of Agriculture or something, and Wickard I think, or I might have him backwards. I don't think so. But anyhow, he was a wheat farmer in Ohio. He raised some grains, but he used the grains entirely for himself and his family, and maybe to feed the livestock that he had on his place. In other words, he didn't market any of them. Okay, and I think, heck, this might have gone back to the 30s. I think I said 70s or 80s, but this might have gone back to the 30s when they were really trying to implement controls over production in order to try to get the prices. They actually wanted the prices to go up. They were trying to create inflation, and they thought they could do that by limiting demand. And so they wanted to limit what he could grow and wanted him to be subject to those limitations, and he sued and said that it's not affecting interstate commerce. The federal government shouldn't have any control over that, and the federal government responded and went to the Supreme Court, and they said, no matter how small, no matter how small the effect may be, the fact that you're producing a commodity, increases the supply of that, even if it's infinitesimal, but it makes it so that it can be regulated by the federal government under the Commerce Clause. So again, it's a very broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Who's the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution? Let's go with C, the Supreme Court, right? Police powers, right? State legislation. The state's been granted the ability to regulate or to pass laws that would protect the public's health, safety, morals, interesting, and general welfare. And again, we're seeing some stuff there that's interesting. So, dormant Commerce Clause limits state police powers. So, In other words, states can't pass laws that are arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable. So we can't pick out people and pass laws against specific people, right? Can't pass unreasonable laws, whatever that interpretation might be. Obviously, one of those big gray areas. Okay. And the Federal Commerce Clause is what prohibits that. So there are areas of regulation, right, of commerce. Some that are exclusively federal and some that are exclusively state, and I would guess a lot of them fall into the dual regulation. But there's federal preemption, meaning that federal law is going to be the one that we look at, the one that we rely upon, and think. I guess I often think in terms of like California and the EPA. Okay, the EPA has all kinds of regulations in regards to pollution, etc. And we all know California has their own standards, right? They do in terms of vehicles and other things. And that's the preemption, right? States have to go for, or within the state anyhow, people have to abide by the federal law at a minimum, but they can have even higher levels of regulation if the state so desires, right? And that's fine. Again, if there's irreconcilable conflicts, then we go to the preemption, meaning that federal and states can't place an undue burden on their folks. Okay, an undue burden mean one that's doesn't have any reasonableness, I guess you might say. Okay, and then when there's no federal regulation, it's fine for states to step in and provide some. Can't have discrimination, however. State taxation, right? It's a form of regulation. It can be, right? We can pass taxes on liquor and taxes on tobacco and those types of things, and virtually all states have those. Okay, it is somewhat limited by the Commerce Clause. There's apportionment. How do you figure out what Walmart ought to pay for taxes in the state of Montana? It's not headquartered in Montana, but it makes money here in Montana, right? And what the federal government has said is that they're allowed to apportion, and states have to come up with reasonable formulas that would allow companies to apportion the income. Right, so Walmart may not have to keep track of every penny of sales and their costs and whatnot exactly. They may be able to just base it on a certain percentage. And I don't know, that that's the formula that Montana has, but saying that it could be something like that, right? There has to be a sufficient tie or a nexus, and I think taxable situs, the book says, relates to property taxes, and what that says is that in order to assess a tax on somebody or some entity, they have to have a reasonable connection, and the tax has to have a reasonable connection. So if people own property in Montana, it's reasonable to assume that they use Montana's roads and public services, and so to have a property tax is perfectly appropriate. But just because they own property, we might not be able to tax them on the income that they get from other states, if that makes sense. And so, there's got to be a tie, is basically what they're saying. So most of our regulations come through administrative agencies, and there's a boatload of administrative agencies, and it's growing. Okay, and basically what it says is that our lives have become so complex, and our societies become so complex that we can't expect that Congress, right, should on a day-to-day basis kind of regulate what's going on. Can you imagine Congress trying to on a day-to-day basis administer even the environmental parts of our society? It would be very, very difficult. Okay. It'd be impossible. And so instead they set up administrative agencies to kind of look after those things. So there you go. Good time to take a drink of water. There you go. That'd be the Weather Service. So we talk about administrative agencies, and we've seen increases in government's influence and big time, and some administrations obviously far more than others. I think people would argue that in the last 6 years we've seen huge increases in the government's influence on our lives through the regulatory mechanisms. And in fact, we have a president who's boldly said that he plans to use those to the administrative agencies, executive agencies, to enforce his what he believes will make the country better. Okay, and we've seen a huge increase in that, I would say, in the last 6 years. And I think most people would argue that that's probably true. Administrative laws, regulatory process, right? And we have them at the federal, state, local level. So at the federal level, think FAA or FDA, right? Federal Food and Drug Administration, the FAA, Federal Aviation, FCC, Federal Communications Commission, on and on and on. They might be called commissions, bureaus, departments, all those things, right? And a lot of the agencies might be sub agencies or sub-departments of other major departments, like the Department of Interior, I think, has the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs is sure an agency, and it's a subsection isn't the right word. I'm trying to find the right word there, but it's a part of the Department of Interior, and a lot of our agencies are set up that way. At the state level, think Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, right? Montana Highway Department, the Justice Department, the DEQ in Montana, which is the Department of Environmental Quality, which would kind of mirror and do similar things to the Environmental Protection Agency. Okay, and locally we might have agencies too, and the smaller the town, Haver's a small town, but we have a Parks and Rec department. And we've got some things like that, right? A police department would be an agency, as would the fire department. Smaller towns may not have those. Bigger towns certainly would have more. So what do administrative agencies do? They create and enforce a majority. Business laws are rules. They're actually rules that are said to have the same effect as laws. Okay, they provide some specificity, some expertise, protection, regulation, and they provide some services. And so, services. Think about the weather. Our national NOAA. They got one of the better weather sites, anyhow, right? And I think a lot of the information, even that private weather providers get, probably comes from our federal agency that provides a weather service. Okay, and they just download it and change the look of it, and away they go, right? They provide protection. Think of the FBI or NSA, right? They provide lots of regulation. Think of Franken-Dodd, OSHA, okay, EPA, those types of things. They provide some expertise, and again, you might go back to the Weather Bureau. You might go back to some different things like that. Certainly, OSHA provides a lot of expertise in workplace safety and whatnot. And they provide some specificity, and I think that's in regards to the Congress often passes laws that are very general in nature, that we're going to set this up, and then the agencies are entrusted with actually making the specific rules that are going to apply to those things. Okay, we'll talk about BLM and stuff a little bit later, but some examples, and these are probably in your book. There's dozens and dozens, and we might have a dozen of them here, but there's dozens and dozens of different ones that are out there. So even the Internal Revenue Service is an agency. So what do? They got functions, and 4 of them, right? Rulemaking, adjudicating, advising, and investigating. So rulemaking is they make rules. So they're given a very broad charter from Congress and signed by the president. They're given a broad charter, and then they design and make rules within their broad charter. We're seeing that, I think, a lot. And again, we've seen it a lot with the EPA. Probably public ones that you're familiar with are, rules regarding pollution. We just saw one. What was it, nitrous oxide that they came down on, and they just changed. Okay, again, there wasn't any congressional action. The agency itself proposed it and is moving ahead with it, and they're moving on carbon too when we talk about the EPA. Okay, they also do adjudicating, and adjudicating is settling disputes maybe between the agency and private individuals or private companies. So that's the law part of it. advising then, and certainly they give lots of advice. Again, I think workplace safety and national, think about the National Highway, what is it, NHTSA, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, and the advising that they provide in terms of helping to make vehicular travel safer, on and on and on, those types of things, right? And they do investigating. And another good example, or there's a good one for airplane safety. Anytime there's an airplane wreck, even around the world, I think they send the experts from the U.S. and from the it's not the Aviation Administration, it's probably a sub-department of that, or sub-agency of the FAA, but can't remember what it's called, but anyhow, it's the transportation and for airplanes and whatnot, and they investigate, and their investigations have turned up answers that have thus prevented future or tragedies happening later. So rulemaking is a quasi-legislative function, so it's kind of like passing laws, right? But they do it in a little different fashion. They can be industry specific, or generally cover-all. I think that's supposed to say cover-all, or generally cover-all. So yeah, so OSHA, for example, probably has lots of industry-specific rules. Industries that are maybe more hazardous, but they probably also pass some rules that would cover everything. Maybe doorway thresholds or something, and how they're supposed to be built, and provided. So, okay. And guidelines can be published. And guidelines don't have any effective law, but again, those are advising, giving people ideas of things that they can do, right? So agency decisions do have to go through a due process, and this is a process that we've established, right? There's public notice of proposed rules, and you can get this in the Federal Register. You can actually go look up at the Federal Register and see what rules are being proposed. There has to be a hearing, okay? Citizens can write letters to the agency itself. They can contribute, okay? If you remember recently, in the last few years anyhow, the Upper Missouri National Monument, its administration or its management was given primarily to the BLM, and the BLM held several public hearings, open public hearings. They traveled around the area and held hearings and allowed people to come in and express their opinions and do those types of things. And a lot of people did participate in those, and they also, probably a lot of people wrote letters to either the agency itself or to the members of Congress and expressed their concerns. And those things should be taken into consideration. Sometimes we think they're not, but they should be taken into consideration when those rules are made. Keep in mind though that while you may have one point of view, there could be 100 other people that have a different point of view and that are also expressing those thoughts. So guidelines kind of talked about that. They're things, advice, ideas that agencies might come up with that could help people, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a defense. So yeah. This kind of went back a little bit, but it does have to do, a little bit with the NSA and Edward Snowden and those types of issues, and what do they know about us and what don't they know about us? And Loretta Lynch would be the current Attorney General. I just had to update that because she was just appointed here, I think, over the summer, if I'm not mistaken. Eric Holder had held that position, I think, through most of the Obama administration, all of it until just recently, and then he had backed away and Loretta Lynch was appointed. And I hope, I'll have to try to check the test, because I hope that if I ask that question on the test, I'll have to update the potential answer. So adjudicating, right? Quasi-judicial function. There's actually over 1,000 administrative law judges in the United States, so there's a bunch, right? And they're experts not only, they're lawyers that have become judges, and they're experts not only in the law, but they're also experts in those fields, right? So administrative law judges are very specific as to a field, and so somebody that's an administrative law judge in occupational safety, right, is an expert in those things. And so it's kind of, it actually is kind of cool, that if you do have to go, you're dealing with somebody that is an expert in that field. So they do fact finding, which is usually left up to a jurist, but in administrative law, it's left up to a judge. They can issue cease and desist orders, which says you will stop that behavior or else. And they also issue a lot of consent orders, and what I probably talk about these later, but we'll go through them. But a cease and desist order, yeah, if you were engaging in a practice that was deemed against the rules of that particular agency, they could issue a letter that says you will cease and desist, period. And if you don't, you're violating the law, and we're going to come and shut you down, close you down, we're going to arrest you, we're going to do the things that we can do legally in order to cause you to cease and desist the behavior that you're engaged in, right? Those happen sometimes. Probably far more common are consent orders, and what happens there is and these can range anywhere from real simple ones probably to more complex ones, but if you're examined or regulated by a particular entity, we were in the bank, our main examiners were from like the FDIC and or the Federal Reserve or the state agency that also does that, and they might come in and examine us, and they might go through everything, and 98% of everything that we were doing was just fine, and we'd get a good report, but they would say, hey, we found some problems here and here, and that was common with every examination, that you're always going to have a couple problems. They had to justify their pay, of course, and so they would write up a consent order. We agreed to change this behavior, and fine, we just we'd agree to it, and then we'd change it, put in place. And some of them are really important, don't get me wrong. Some of them, we've talked about some of the embezzling things and stuff that have gone on, and so that was a case where maybe they would catch it at another bank and what was going on, and so they'd come in and say, you guys might want to update your practice here in order to stop that type of thing from happening here. And we might end up signing a consent order, and it was wonderful for both sides, right? It might keep us from suffering that same type of a deal. So I guess I already kind of went over those. But what happens if you don't? So if there's a cease and a desist, and then what happens if you don't follow the terms of that? Yes, they haul your butt off. Yeah. Advising, right? Making reports to the President or Congress, so they advise, not only, I think I said they advise the businesses, and that they certainly do, but they also, of course, report back to the President or Congress as to what's going on, good or bad, investigating science, the USDA, FDA, all those or all those agencies and whatnot that report things, and there's some, I'm sure, that regulate schools and all those other things, right? Okay, and so they publish advisory opinions, and you can find lots of opinions that are brought out. I read a lot from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. I like to look at some of their stuff, right? I know I don't have a life, but it is kind of interesting. So, the Census Bureau, right? Facts. Look at all the facts and stuff, and we use a lot of that for a business, right? Where if you're doing a business plan and you want to see how many people live, how many guys between the age of 30 and 50 live in Havre. And guess what? You can go to the Census Bureau and figure that out. So, investigating. Okay, yeah, subpoena power. They do have some subpoena power. Again, probably through the judges, right? Doesn't mean that they can just walk in and say, I'm going to get this. The subpoena's probably got to go through a legal process, just like any other subpoena that would be issued. Examine witnesses under oath, copy documents, etc., etc. It's a crime to lie to an agency. Yeah, it is. So filing false reports, doing things like that. FSA, Farm Safe or Farm Service Agency, right? There's been some cases where farmers ranchers have filed improper documents, and it's a lie. They can be in trouble. Okay, they're set up usually. They have a chairperson, right? Presides at the meetings, appointed by the president. Secretary takes agency minutes or probably delegates that to somebody, and they are the legal custodian of the records. They do have a general counsel, and it's also usually ratified by the Senate, so that's the main legal person, right, the chief legal person within that. And then they have an executive director that typically supervises administrative functions and the day-to-day types of things. So like a lot of other organizations or businesses, really. They do have administrative law judges, advisory councils, folks maybe that are in those industries that sit on there and advise them the things that are going on. Okay. Public hearing, we kind of talked about, right? Public can present evidence supporting or opposing those different types of things. Okay. Government control. So their powers aren't unlimited, and they get reined in occasionally, right? Because the president appoints chairs and can remove them, right? If the president isn't happy, we saw some stuff happening with the IRS, and Lois Lerner is probably the name that came up, and she was a little lower on the totem pole. She wasn't the director of the IRS, but she was a high-profile person within the IRS, and she ultimately resigned, I think, but it was under a lot of pressure over stuff, that was going on, right? And so those things, those are some of the controls that the government, the Congress, and the president have. And in her case, it was the Congress that had brought the pressure, but the president oftentimes brings the pressure. And we see that with employees or with directors and whatnot, maybe that have misstepped their bounds. They've gotten out of bounds, and a lot of times you'll hear the public pressure coming down, and then the president. Think the VA, right? And there's been one or two VA directors, that have stepped down because things weren't happening in the VA to the extent or up to the standards that they ought to have been, and so. There's a lot of pressure that came from the public, and the president asked some of those guys to step down, if I'm not mistaken. Published in the Federal Register, and you can go there, and you can look up what kind of rules and whatnot. There's a bevy of them. I mean, there's a bunch of them. Don't get me wrong, and it's not the absolute easiest, but it gives you recent ones, and I think you can also maybe sort them by type or agency. So it's kind of cool. So can agency decisions be reviewed? Yeah. So you've got an administrative law judge, but is that the full extent of your legal rights? No. An administrative law judge is an expert in that field and understands the law, but that doesn't mean that you can't take it further and say maybe your rights were violated, and so you can. Okay, unless there are some statutes where it's precluded, and I would guess it's some real specific things. Okay, I'm not familiar with any off the top of my head, but where they preclude review from the judiciary outside of that particular agency. Agency's actions committed to an agency discretion by law. So again, if the agency's actions are really specific, that's not to say that you can't ask a court to review it, but they're probably just going to refuse, is what that means. Okay, and they would have a right to do that. So, okay, the aggrieved party must be harmed by the agency action to have a standing, right? So we go back to talking about standing and your ways to get in court. Then the harm can be economic or non-economic. So, again, if OSHA came in and shut you down because they thought you were violating a safety standard and you didn't think you were, right? You would originally have that heard by an administrative law judge and often maybe have a consent order or a cease and desist. But if you didn't like that decision, you could ask the courts to review it, and they may or may not, right? So what do they review if the judiciary does? Well, do the rules and regs fit the power that was granted to that agency, or did the agency step outside of their bounds? Because agencies can do that, and there's the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, is food. It has food, right? But the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, they both have inspection facilities for foods, that are processed and prepared here in the United States, and some of their duties cross over, and it might be up to a judge outside of there to help determine who really does have jurisdiction, if you want to call it that, for those things, right? And then was the delegation valid originally? In other words, was it definite, or did it violate due process that we might have? And agencies' powers, again, are limited to certain areas, and that's kind of my USDA and FDA, and there's lot of overlap there actually that happens. Broad language. So when we set up, even though it was 2,700 pages long, you probably heard a lot of Congress people get on and say with Obamacare that, in fact, old Nancy Pelosi famously said, hey, we have to pass it to see what's in it. And really kind of what she meant is we have to pass it, put it in the hands of the HUD director, who was Sebelius. She might have been under pressure over the whole internet thing, web page thing, and I can't remember if she resigned or not. Huh, isn't that horrible? Should remember that. But Congress does that. They pass broad language bills, and then they expect the agencies to kind of sort those things out. And was the authority exceeded? So did the agency itself exceed the authority that they were granted? Okay, but judicial review is limited. Remember, the experts are within that field. Okay, agency authority is limited. We kind of already talked about that, and they have their own rules of procedure. Courts lack authority to substitute for agency. What that means is that they can't really do the fact finding. They can't look at any of that and say that's right or wrong. All they can look at is make sure that the agency followed the directives that were given to it by Congress, really, and that they didn't overstep their bounds, etc. Exhaustion of remedy says that if you are fighting an agency ruling, you have to exhaust your remedies in that administrative agency before you can take it someplace else, before you can take it through the judiciary. And you'll see that even with the EEOC claims or equal employment opportunity claims. An individual has to exhaust their claim within the EEOC before they could ask a court to intervene. Okay, and oftentimes actually you get a letter from the EEOC that says, hey, we have exhausted our remedies, but you have a right to sue. Okay, and that's other agencies might send out those things as well. And it says that the primary jurisdiction does reside in those agencies. So, if you have that type of a claim, an employment type of a claim, you're probably going to have to go through the EEOC first, or in Montana, the Human Rights Commission or Human Rights Bureau, okay, and because they have primary jurisdiction, and only when it's been resolved through there would you have access then maybe to the judiciary. Equal Access to Justice Act, I thought I had that in here. I think that talks about small companies and small net worth of individuals and whatnot, and how they can be reimbursed for expenses perhaps that they incur when they're fighting these things if they're in fact proven to be correct. I think that comes up a little later. Okay. Court presumes that the findings of fact are correct. So again, they don't put themselves in place of the fact finding within the agency. They'll analyze the agency proceedings, make sure that the process was right? So they don't reweigh evidence. They don't make an independent determination. Things we kind of already talked about. Yep. Here's the equal access. So successful business challenge to agency business may collect their attorney's fees, right? It's limited. Individuals with a net worth of less than that, or businesses. So it's limited to small businesses. If you're a bigger business, you're expected to be able to handle those types of fees, I guess. Okay. And the government won't pay if they feel that their actions were substantially justified. So even if you win and you're that small, you may not get reimbursed. So criticisms, right? And we're seeing a lot of criticisms right now. Regulation is a form of taxation. It is. It's if you go through, if you read some of the economics, some of the boring things that I read in Bureau of Economic Analysis and whatnot, it'll tell you that regulations in the U.S. probably cost in excess of $1 trillion per year. Okay, and technically that's out of yours and my pocket. I mean, you can say that the corporations or those people are bearing the cost, but all those costs always come back to the consumer, and so there is a cost. There's also a benefit though too, right? I mean, we would all we're all happy that the air we breathe is relatively clean and doesn't contribute to a whole lot of cancer and asthma and those types of things, right? And so there's a cost and a benefit to those things. We're all happy that when we get on an airplane, it's relatively secure and obviously very, very safe. I mean, we've had very, very few airplane crashes through the years. and a lot of that is because of what happens. So there's certainly a cost, but there's a benefit. Okay. Now, regulation forces bureaucracy in businesses, and that's absolutely true. Businesses have to have staff sometimes, especially bigger businesses. They have to have staffs that can comply, and that's what they are. They're compliance. And it can be huge cost. Okay, regulation can stifle competition and innovation. This is probably the one that worries me as much as anything, and we're really seeing in the last, again, 6 years or so, we're seeing a huge, a noticeable and significant decrease in startups. And a part of that reason has to be, or is, because the cost of starting up a business and dealing with the regulatory processes is becoming very, very difficult. It's becoming onerous for folks. And starting up a little go to hell business in your garage is one thing, but when you try to take it to the next step is when it becomes more difficult. And that next step is hiring employees and doing those types of things. Huge cost, huge amount of man hours are spent doing those things. So is there too much or too little, right? If the car industry was deregulated, do you think they would build cars that were as safe and efficient? Well, maybe. Consumers might demand that. They might not. Would you like a drug industry that was fully deregulated? Some people would argue that it would bring more test drugs to market faster, right? But it would probably also cause more people to die from taking drugs that shouldn't be out there, right? So if you could control regulation, what would you do? And I think most of us prudently would say it's kind of a case-by-case thing. Certainly there's some regulations that we all probably are happy to see and happy to have a part of our lives, and we're certainly happy to have some of the services, like I said, the weather service and things like that. But there's also regulations then that have become too onerous in some areas. I don't think there's any question about that. So would you do that? There you go. There we go. We made it through, and not too bad a timing. A little better than a half an hour, so that's not too bad. Study not so much the specific agencies, but the rights and the abilities and those types of things that they have, and how they go about their business, I think, is what's going to be important for this particular test. So thanks, have a good week, and we'll talk to you next week.